Okay. Sorry, I won't hurt your ears with my very terrible French, so I'll be doing my talk in English tonight. So the agenda for tonight is web performance, and we'll just go over some overviews. Sorry. So we'll go over overview of what is web performance and why it's important. We'll then also talk about some metrics, so like a foundation of what metrics are, so we can understand actually what we're trying to measure. So we'll then talk about some tools we can use to measure, some use cases, and then finally just a conclusion. Okay, so a bit of an introduction. So my name is Shelton Wilson. I'm from South Africa, and I'm a senior front-end engineer for Vestiaire Collective. In French, my colleagues call me Shelton Wisson. So I work for what is called the seller experience, right? And the seller experience is essentially responsible for listing all items on the Vestiaire Collective platform, right? Previously to that, I was working under Eric in what was called the platform experience in the core web team specifically. And we were responsible for a couple of things, right? So number one, we were responsible for developer success when we were working with web technologies. We were also responsible for maintaining the technical integrity of our web platform. We were also responsible for improvements on the core technologies that we use. So, migrations, upgrades as an example. And then finally, we were also responsible for reporting KPIs to business, right, for business performance. This is really important because we were ultimately responsible for monitoring the application as well, which brings me to the topic of my talk, so performance for web applications. So I think it's important for us to start at the very beginning so we can understand actually what it is we're trying to measure when we talk about web performance, right? So a good place to start is the MDN web documents, and it reads like this. So web performance is the objective measurement and perceived user experience of a website or application, right? The key word here being objective, because if you're talking about objectives that we set, we need to be able to measure towards those objectives, right? And this is where metrics actually start to come in for us. So when we're talking about metrics, we need to understand actually why these metrics are important, right? Particularly for business impact. So for a business like Vestiaire Collective, right, that really depends on a user's engagement with our platform, right? We need to be able to measure performance, right, so that we can be extremely careful and extremely sure that the user is actually having a good experience on our website, right? So these metrics can typically be broken into two subsets. So we have the first one, which is core web vitals. This is the big one, and this is one of the ones that is actually a ranking factor for SEO on Google, right? So for us, it directly impacts our application's visibility online, right? And then we can start talking about web vitals, right? And along with the core web vitals, both of these combined will be able to tell us exactly what the user is experiencing on our website. And then finally, we can say that our performance metrics can actually be linked to the business performance as well, which we'll talk about at the end of the slide. So as a foundation, what are metrics, right? So we'll start with the core web vitals for anybody who doesn't know. So core web vitals, again, a ranking factor for SEO. We have the big one, which is LCP. It's called largest contentful paint. And this is the paint or the render of the largest element on the page. So if you land on a website, it's usually an image or a large piece of media content, right? Then we have what's called the cumulative layout shift, or CLS. And this essentially measures the website's stability over time, right? So cumulative is also a keyword here because, you might find that the bottom of the website, the layout shift at the bottom of the website actually shifts a lot more than at the top of the website. And this is what cumulative actually means. Then we have what's called the first input delay, right? This is depreciated, but I think it's also really important to understand what it's actually measuring. So this is actually the delay from the interaction to the response, right? So if as a user, I click on a action on our website, and then I'll get a response from our server or from a CDN. That one is actually depreciated in favor of the next one, which is interaction to next paint, right? And interaction to next paint is one that goes a little bit further in that it measures the time from the interaction, but to the actual painting of the action or of the website that's associated with that action, right? So if I click somewhere on the website and something happens on the screen, that is the interaction to the next paint. The next one is called Core Vitals, right? This one is important for obviously measuring user experience. The first one here is first contentful paint. And this is either the rendering or the painting of the very first initial request. So if I hit the website, that very first thing that I see on the website, that is the first contentful paint. The next one is called speed index. And this is the time from our above metric, the first contentful paint, to the loading of the site, right? And then finally, we have total blocking time. This is where a user is actually unable to interact with our web application until we actually get a response. There's some other metrics, and I'll just mention these two quickly. These also help us understand what is happening on our site. We got TTFB, there's a lot of abbreviations. So we have time to first byte. And this is essentially just the first request to the initial response. So I do a first request, the first response that I see, and it might be the HTML document, that is the time to first byte. And then finally, we have loading time, and this is self-explanatory. For any gamers out there, you know that loading time essentially means that once everything is loaded and we're able to go. So you might be asking yourself, like, whose responsibility is this, right? And what we have here is what's called the shared responsibility model. It's not necessarily the front-end team's responsibility. It's a shared responsibility, right? And a good example here is that if we have perhaps some latency in our network, or we might be waiting for an API to respond, or we might be waiting for a database lookup, it might affect the response that the user might see at the end of the day, right? So this is why it's important for us to be able to monitor up and down the entire application stack. So let's talk about some tools, all right? We'll talk about the first one, which is rum. Besides being a tasty alcoholic beverage, it's also what's called real user monitoring, right? And its significance here is that it's very user-centric, right? It allows us to be able to measure what is happening on the client side of our application, right? It's used in conjunction with something called APM, right, which is application performance monitoring. And APM typically helps us measure what is happening on the back-end side of our application, right? These two go hand in hand, so you'll be able to monitor the entire request lifecycle and see what is happening across the entire content stack. So some of the tools that we typically use for measuring RUM, some of the popular ones, Splunk, New Relic, Datadog, DNA Trace. For us at Vestia Collective, we use Datadog, and we use Datadog for both RUM as well as for APM monitoring. So how does it actually work for anybody who doesn't know? So essentially, RUM employs events, logs, and traces, and it helps us capture what the client is actually doing on the website. And then it sends all of those logs, events, and traces back to the monitoring platform, and then we'll be able to see what the user is actually doing on the website, right? It also allows us to do some error tracking, right? So we'll be able to pinpoint exactly where errors are happening within the request lifecycle. And a good example here is that a user interacts with our website. We then initialize the RUM client library, and then we start streaming some logs and events back to the monitoring platform, right? From this, we'll be able to tell things like what is the total blocking time for a particular action, because we've sent an event when a user actually initiates an action, and then we'll send an event when the action is actually finished. So what are some of the benefits? So if we're talking about RUM, it allows us to monitor real time. And it also allows us to react in real time as well. It also provides us some long-term metric comparison. So if we're talking about measuring a previous version of our application to a new version of our application, this is what RUM will be able to allow us to do. It also gives us analytics. So remember I said that it allows us to be able to see what the users actually doing on our website. This is really important, that this isn't actually a replacement for better suited tools like Google Analytics, right? It also allows us to measure what the user is actually experiencing on our website, right? So if we go in and we release a new feature, this will be able to tell us what the user is experiencing with that new feature. And then finally, as I mentioned, being able to effectively find and track errors. The next tool we'll talk about is something called SpeedCurve. If anybody doesn't know, SpeedCurve is a platform that allows us to do synthetic monitoring as well as real user monitoring, right? What SpeedCurve allows us to do, it gives us some various different dimensions for testing, right? So we'll be able to simulate different types of browsers. We'll be able to simulate different types of network conditions. We'll be able to simulate different types of devices as well as geolocations, right? This is important because, as an example, we might be wanting to test the impact of an API payload, or we might be wanting to test the impact of a new API, a icon pack. And we might be particularly concerned by a device that might be an Android device in a remote location using a 3G connection. We'll be able to go and simulate this exact environment within SpeedCurve, which will then allow us to be able to take some action. So what are some of the benefits for synthetic monitoring, right? Synthetic monitoring, again, is just an augmented version of a user environment. It's not a real user environment, but it allows us to be able to deploy some defensive practices when we are deploying an application, right? So actively preventing any issues before it even gets to our users in production. It also allows us to monitor, particularly for third-party applications. So we know that we might have Google Analytics as an example, or we might be doing some feature flag analysis with LaunchDarkly. We need to download the scripts, right? But it's scripts that we don't really control from our side of things, right? We have to download them. We'll be able to go in and measure the impact of those scripts on our final application. It also allows us to be able to test new code and new features before they even reach our users in production. And then finally, it allows us to do some benchmarking against our peers in the industry for us to be able to stay competitive as a business. The last one, we'll talk about Lighthouse, and I'm sure most people know what Lighthouse is, but for anybody who doesn't know, it's an open source tool for being able to audit an application, right? This is an important distinction because the previous tool is actually monitoring, right? This here is actually doing an audit of our application. And what's important here is that we're actually doing an audit in time, right? So when we do an audit, many things can be happening at the same time. We might have network latency, we might have some backend API calls that aren't responding well. So those do affect the metrics as well. This is an open source tool and it's integrated into Google Chrome. So really anybody can pull up Google Chrome, open up the Lighthouse console and actually do an audit on any application, any website that you really want to. It also has a CLI, and for us, we're able to integrate it into our CI/CD pipeline so that we can run audits even before we do a release. So what is the role of Lighthouse? It's mainly a development tool for auditing your application. It's not necessarily meant to be used in production, right? So Lighthouse is a tool that we can use during the development lifecycle to be able to test, features that we're building. What it does for us is that we'll be able to gain insight into our features and our pages by particularly doing audits on performance, audits on SEO, and audits on accessibility. Right, so before everybody gets tired of my voice, let's spice this presentation up with some demos. So this one is a demo on RUM, right? And this is something we built under the core web team. And this was actually meant to be able to give the power back to our collectives, right? So Eric explained that we have different teams within our organization, and this is to enable collectives to be able to see the performance within their scope. So I'll play the video, and I'll do a voiceover. I know I said you might be tired of my voice, but we'll keep going. So we built a custom dashboard. So if we go onto dashboards and we do a search for web performance, we can see our dashboard there. We can go in, and we're also able to see our metrics right off the bat, right? So we're able to see how our site is performing both on desktop as well as mobile. On our little graph here, we can actually see at any point in time what the performance was for our website. On the right-hand side, we mentioned giving the power back to collectives, where they'll be able to see how their pages and their features are actually performing within their scope, right? So we'll be able to see what the metrics are within a specific given scope. And you can see that our metrics are pretty good. And not to brag. And then finally, we can go in and we can see some of the errors that we're looking at. So we'll look at this error. So this one says it's a launch Darkly flag error. And we can go in and we can actually see the traces, and we'll be able to pinpoint where that is actually happening. So we can actually see the count of these errors as well. Finally, what we're also able to do is we're able to run some filters. So we can filter by Europe as a continent. We can then go in and we can filter by device as well. And you can see how things are changing as we move along. And then we can go in and we can select a specific page, right? So we can do comparison. For this one, I selected the product page. And then finally, we can also go in and we can look at the exact country. So for France, our metrics are amazing, not to brag again, but they look really, really good. Cool. So finally, I'll be able to go in and save this view. So if I save this as my great view, I can then go in and I can share this with some of my other teammates, other collectives as well. And I can actually come back to the site, select my great view, and it'll have all my filters on it. Cool. Let's stop that one there. And let's get into the next one. So this is a demo on speed curve, right? And this is actually my favorite demo. And essentially what it enables us to do is we can go in and we can actually click on vitals, right? So remember we mentioned core vitals and vitals. We can go in and we can actually see what the performance is for our website, right? So currently at this given point in time, this is what our metrics looks like. And we can even go down for cumulative layout shift, the one that I mentioned earlier. We can actually go in and we can see where our layout has actually shifted over time, right? So you can see the headings and the text has shifted over time. And, we'll be able to use this tool to be able to go in and fix those issues as well. The next one is synthetic monitoring. We spoke about that. And this is the favorite part of the demo. I'll select what we call the product list page, right? And I'm going to filter by a specific date. And this date is quite important to us because the front-end team made the shift from using Angular on our platform to using Next.js on our platform with React. And if we go in, you can see the very, very big difference in the metrics. We were already on a downward trend, but you can actually see that we went into the green at the end of November. And right there on the 4th of November is actually when we made the switch over. So it's amazing that we can see, this is in 2022, it's amazing that we can actually see the difference and again, the metrics over time. Cool, I'll stop this one here. And we'll get into the conclusion. So if it sounds like all of this is, me repeating myself, it's because I somewhat am. And it's essential to understand because when we're talking about like strengths and weaknesses, we need to understand our tools, right? So particularly knowing what a tool can do, what it can't do, right? If we put these all together, it'll essentially be able to give us, again, a full perspective of what our application is doing. So we'll be able to measure from different angles, right? This is particularly important for a full stack rendered application and a lot of backend services, and particularly for business impact, right? So as I promised, I said I was going to talk about some business stuff, and here it is. So the impact, here's a couple of examples, the impact for business, right? So if we're talking about things like leads for Bestia Collective, again, SEO is really, really important for us, right? So we need to be able to make sure our SEO is right. And that's why the core web vitals directly affects our availability online, right? Then we can talk about conversion rates, and conversion rates is what happens when a user eventually buys something. Eventually, when they, browsing through our website, they've seen something that they like, they actually want to buy this item. These are directly affected by the user experience, so both the core web vitals as well as the web vitals. And then finally, bounce rates, because we want to keep users around. This is one that is shared particularly by all team members and all collectives. So it's essential for us to make sure that every single feature within our scope is performing really, really well. And then finally is engagement, right? Again, I said in the beginning, Bestia Collective depends on engagement. This is one that's also shared amongst teams, so we need to keep users engaged. So if a feature is not performing well and a user doesn't like that feature is performing well, they might drop off of the site, which is something that we don't really want, right? So we need to make sure that that is actually performing really, really well. So that's the end. That's my story. And thank you for listening. Thank you for attending. In the interest of time, I'll hand over to the next speaker. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, probably not Facebook, but X. You can reach out to me on X as well. And thank you. Have a good evening.